Hi. Welcome to my talk, Digital Scorched Earth, Understanding APT-Driven Cyber Destruction. In this talk, we will try to understand how and why nation-state actors use wipers as a cyber weapon of war. And we'll dive into our novel research about super interesting of a recent campaign we discovered of an Iranian APT agonizing serpents targeting organizations in the Middle East to advance its geopolitical agenda. I'm Chechik, a principal security researcher from Palo Alto Networks. I love low-level research, Windows internals, reverse engineering, etc. Before we review the agenda for today, I'd like to thank my colleagues Danielle and Asaf, whom I work with on this research and the blog post. They couldn't attend this conference, but they deserve the credit as much as I am. So as for the agenda for this talk, we will talk about wipers in general. Then we'll provide some brief history about the usage of wipers by APT groups. Then we'll discuss how wipers work and why and how threat actors use them as digital weapons of mass destruction. Then we'll dive into our research of an ongoing Iranian APT campaign that targets organizations in the Middle East with wipers. We'll show the attribution process, the attack cycle, as well as new TTPs. And finally, discuss some key takeaways. So let's begin with an introduction into wipers, into what is actually a wiper. So if you ask ChatGPT, he'll tell you a wiper is a tool or device used for cleaning or wiping surfaces, such as the windshield wipers for vehicles or cleaning wipes for household surfaces. But now for real, what is a wiper? A wiper is a type of malware designed to cause destruction. It is built to destroy data. It's also built to render infected systems unusable, and some even use it to erase evidence of the malicious execution. Wiper differs from a ransomware in that it aims to permanently destroy data without offering any means of recovery. If you look at a typical wiper execution, the wiper will iterate the user files, corrupt them, then it will corrupt the MBR, and finally reboot the system so the computer won't boot again. And now let's overview some history about wipers used by nation-state actors. So over the past 12 years, and especially since the inception of the conflict in Ukraine, there have been numerous large-scale cyber attacks where nation-state actors used wipers as a cyber weapon of war. In this section, we'll explore a few notable APT cases to grasp the impact such attacks can cause and examine how wipers serve as potent tools in cyber warfare and geopolitical conflicts. We carefully selected a few cases that we believe will convey the message, that you will get the point. We'll start off with Shamoon, an Iranian APT targeting Saudi Arabia. Then we'll discuss Dark Seoul Jakra, which is a wiper used by North Korean APT targeting South Korea. Later we'll talk about the notorious Peria Not Peria, a wiper used by a Russian APT originally targeting Ukraine, but due to its self-propagation capabilities, became the most devastating malware to date. And lastly, we'll talk about Hermetic Wiper, a wiper used by a Russian APT targeting Ukraine amid the war of Ukraine and Russia. As for agonizing serpents, the last one you see, that's our research, which is the new and most interesting part of this talk. It will have its own section later on. So Shamoon. Shamoon is actually one of the earliest instances of wiper used by an APT group. It made its headlines around 2012 with its attacks on Saudi Aramco, which is the Saudi Arabia state-owned national oil company. In that attack, Shamoon actually wiped around 30,000 systems. It replaced the files with propaganda images. Then in 2016, it returned again and affected various organizations in the Persian Gulf, including the Saudi Arabia General Authority of Civil Aviation. Over the years, it got better. It upgraded its techniques, started overwriting files with random data and using third-party drivers. The driver it used was named Aldos Rodisk to override the MBR. Researchers attributed Shamoon to a group called APT-33, and it is believed that the motivations behind the attack was geopolitical. They wanted to inflict significant economic and reputational damage to Saudi Arabia. Now let's move to another example. Dark Seoul. In 2013, computer networks of 3 large banks in South Korea and 2, I think, of the largest TV channel were shut down. Many citizens were in shock and were unable to withdraw money from ATM machines and watch their favorite TV channel. The organizations were attacked by a wiper named Chakra, which corrupted the files on the infected systems and the MBR. The attack itself happened during heightened tensions between the North and South Korea, with a history of North Korea engaging in cyber operations to advance its geopolitical agenda. Researchers found a lot of similarities between this attack and previous attacks by a group named Lazarus Group, which is a North Korean APT group. Let's move to our next example. I'm sure most of you recognize this screen. And what is the next example? Yes, the notorious Petya NotPetya. So NotPetya first emerged in 2017, masquerading as a ransomware. That means, by fake ransomware, it means that even if the ransom was paid, there was no actually a way to recover the data. So NotPetya actually targeted organizations in Ukraine when it started. But due to the fact it used the NSA exploit, Eternal Blue, it quickly led it to spread globally. Researchers found that the patient zero for the attack was actually an update server for a popular Ukrainian accounting software known as Medoc. The attackers breached that server and planted their software there as a watering hole to distribute their malware. As for technical analysis, NotPetya infected the MBR with its own bootkit. That bootkit then encrypted the MFT, making the computer unable to boot and unable to access its files. We'll talk more about MBR and MFT, all those subjects later on when we'll talk about wiper techniques. So this attack also happened amid heightened tensions between Ukraine and Russia. And it appeared to be a politically motivated attack that many attribute to the Russian GRU and a state-sponsored actor named Sandworm. And now we're getting to our last example, Hermetic Wiper. So Hermetic Wiper is another Russian example. It was used just hours before the invasion of Russia. A campaign of this wiper targeted hundreds of systems in at least 5 Ukrainian organizations. That wiper destroys the MBR of the infected system, and as well as MFT, like NotPetya, and other imported files using a benign partition manager named EaseUS Partition Manager. So it actually uses a similar technique to Shamoon, just using a different driver. Since the beginning of 2022, there have been 25 wiper attacks that have been observed in Ukraine. And most of those attacks were attributed to Russia, the APT Sandworm. So actually this was the last example. And now we kinda can understand the impact wipers can have, and we will now delve into the motivation behind using a wiper as a cyber weapon of war. So, as we understood, wipers serve as a potent tool in the realm of cyber warfare and geopolitical conflicts. Wipers can cause real-world consequences for individuals, businesses, even governments. And as we see, there have been numerous large-scale cyber attacks orchestrated by nation-state actors and they use wipers as cyber weapon of war. But why they do it? So they actually do it to advance their geopolitical agenda in conflicts. And they achieve it using many ways. They can do it by crippling adversaries' capabilities. They can do it by causing chaos, by making computers not work. They can do it by sowing fear. And they can do it just to deliver a political statement without even shooting a bullet or a rocket. So, do you think attribution to a specific nation-state actor is actually important? Do we need to attribute attack to an APT? So, I think yes, but especially when it comes to nations, like nations want to know if they got attacked. And they want to know who is the responsible party. They want to do it mainly because of politics. They want to know so they could protect their national security. They want to do it to deter future attacks. And they want to maintain international relations. However, it's extremely difficult to do so. Because there are actually many tactics that nation-state actors use to complicate attribution by researchers. Let's review a few of known tactics that they use. So, a wiper by itself is used to destroy evidence, like by destroying hard disks, logs, files, and even in some cases they remove their own executable. So, if you want to make a hard disk forensics, and attribution will need at least the executable and logs. So it makes attribution really difficult. Also, nation-state actors sometimes conduct false flag operations. So what that means is that they will leave misleading clues for the researchers. So they will attribute the attack to a different actor, even a different nation. We actually found one of those tactics in our research in agonizing serpents that they wanted us to actually think it's a different nation at all. Another tactic is using compromised infrastructure, where the attacker actually used like a proxy server or a botnet or a server that just breached. And the last example is using proxy groups, where they're using a different group and instruct them to take the responsibility for the attack. So, as we now understand, the nature of wiper attacks coupled with tactics makes the attribution really difficult. And now we've finished with the history section. Let's start with the techniques section so we can actually understand the inner mechanics of wipers, not only what they already did. So let's start with the first technique that is used by wipers, which is file discovery. So a wiper begins by searching for files to destroy. They do it by recursively iterating through the file system, using Windows APIs like find first file and find next file. And they're actually implemented to do as much damage as possible without crushing the system. So many of those wipers will implement different ways so they could keep the stability of the system while they run. They don't want to override anything that will cause the system to crash. So what they do in order to avoid that, they delay or skip or prioritize certain targets or files or paths. So they won't do it. If we look at the code snippet on the right, you can see an example of a typical wiper that its file discovery function, where it uses the Windows APIs, find first file and find next file, to recursively iterate through the file system directories and wipe files. When it finds a path of a folder, it calls the recursive function again. But when it's not a folder, it calls the wipe file function on that path. So when you naively think of a wipe function, you don't see the implementation here, but when you think about a function like this, you think about a function that just deletes the file, right? However, this approach might not be as effective as you might think. File deletion is not enough. Why is that? Because of the way file deletion works. So if you want to learn a bit about how file deletion works, let's look at the MSDN documentation on the screen at the highlighted text. So when files are deleted from an NTFS file system volume, their MFT entries are marked as free and may be reused. However, disk space that has been allocated for those entries is not relocated and the size of the MFT does not decrease. So let's just explain what we just read. The NTFS file system has a file called MFT. It's the master file table. It holds metadata for every file in the file system, like where the data is stored and how big the data is. So when the operating system deletes a file from disk, the deletion will not be effective because the data can still be recovered. Like the content itself is not touched. The file is only marked as deleted in the MFT itself, in the table. So let's say we have a wiper that wants to delete a file. If it just deletes the file, the data can still be found. You can search it on the hard disk by file carving techniques that are used in digital forensics. And that is why also you might understand now that NotPetya actually destroyed the MFT. It didn't want people to access the files. So with all that knowledge, we can now understand why we're gonna look into the next technique, file overwrite. So to make files unrecoverable, you need to overwrite them before you delete them. Most wipers do just that. Some of them overwrite just a few bytes, and some of them overwrite the entire files. And overwriting the entire file is actually a very costly operation. If we look at the code snippet on the right, you see that the code overwrites the entire file by determining its file size using the WinAPI get file size. It allocates memory of the same size it found, and then overwrites the file using write file. So actually, write file is the most common way that wipers do it. But it's not the only way. There are more unique ways that you could do it. For example, we have a wiper that is known by name 00. It's a wiper that was used against Ukraine. And it was able to overwrite files with zeros using an API called NTFS control file, with the file system control code of set 0 data. By calling this API, this wiper was able to instruct the file system driver to overwrite the file for him with zeros. And now we're gonna go into our next technique, disk destruction. Many wipers make sure to overwrite the MBR of the disk by the Android execution to make the computer not boot again. They do it to actually create chaos and disruption, so the operational of the organization won't work again. What is MBR? So actually, MBR is the first section of the disk, and it tells the OS how to boot the operating system. If the MBR is destroyed, the computer won't boot. So if we look on the code snippet on the right, it's another typical implementation used by many wipers to corrupt the MBR. If you look, it uses the create file W WinAPI with the parameter of physical drive 0, which is a way to raw access the first sector of disk and then use write file to corrupt it. Another example is by using ioctl. It became really popular among wipers to use this technique because it could be more evasive against EDRs and security solutions because the wiping itself is done by the kernel. The wiper will let the file system driver do the wiping for him by sending an ioctl, which is an input-output control code, which is basically an operation to tell the device driver to do something for you. Last example is third-party drivers. It is also a very effective approach that they use, and is very similar to the ioctl approach, in just that the driver is not a Microsoft one, it's actually a third-party one. And the reasons for using third-party drivers is a lot similar to the ioctl, in that a lot of security solutions will get bypassed by this technique because it happens by a driver. Another example is that attackers really don't want to invest their own time into writing drivers that could crash mid-operation and could actually alert the security teams about a breach. Another reason is that they'll have to sign their drivers because in modern Windows systems, you can't load an unsigned driver. So they will also need to bypass this security mechanism. So in both cases of ioctl and third-party drivers, the attacker will communicate with the driver with usually device I control with some sort of ioctl that he found beforehand to instruct the driver to wipe the MBR. The next example we're gonna look into is reboot, and it is the last one we cover. So to finish its execution, the wiper will initiate a reboot. The wiper does that so he makes sure that the changes he made to the MBR will take effect immediately and will make the computer unable to boot. So if you write a computer software that you corrupt the MBR just now, it won't take effect until the computer is rebooted. So we'll have to make sure that it happens. So if we look at the cut snippet on the right, it's another typical reboot function used by wipers, where the wiper adjusts its privileges to have the shutdown privilege, and then he initiates the reboot using a WinAPI exit Windows EX. So there are several methods that wiper can use to reboot the system, but the common ones are described here. Anti-raise hard error and terminating a critical process will cause a system crash, which will result in blue screen of death, and ultimately a reboot. Exit Windows EX and initiate system shutdown EX can initiate a system shutdown, which then will cause a reboot. So this was our last technique covered. So do you think this knowledge that we just covered can be useful to defenders? So I think it is. If you know that the way wiper works, researchers and analysts can use this data to actually for threat hunting, detection, and prevention. So let's say you have this kind of data in your hands, driver load events and file events and WinAPI events. Let's have some example that you could use them. So let's say you use a driver load event. So you add a rule where a bad driver was loaded. Let's say the one that Shamoon used, LDOS raw disk. If it was loaded, it could be bad. And it's a good indication. Another example would be a WinAPI events. Let's say that someone opens a file handle to physical drive 0, and then it called a reboot API. Some of the ones I saw you earlier. And let's look at the last example. Let's say you can actually understand that the program is using a file create to open lots of files with write, and it actually writes to a lot of files. Then it uses an API to elevate its privileges to have the capability to shut down the system, and then it initiates a reboot. So all those are fine and all, but you need to understand that when dealing with wipers, it's preferable to actually have rules that will block. But if you don't, and there you have too many false positives, then you gotta have something. So now we're getting into the most interesting part of this talk, agonizing serpents. And some of you know this APT by its name of Sentinel-1, Agrius. So we have investigated a series of destructive cyber attacks, and we were able to attribute the attacks to an Iranian APT group we named Agonizing Serpents. We were able to find novel wipers and tools that the group used in their attacks, and reveal that they recently started using new capabilities and techniques to attempt and bypass EDRs. We actually named the group after one of their wipers that we found, BFG Agonizer. We're going to talk about this tool soon. So, who is Agonizing Serpents? This group has been active since 2020. It is known for its wiper and fake ransomware attacks, and it mainly attacks organizations in the Middle East. In most of the recent attacks that we investigated, they actually didn't request ransom. And the attacks were potentially just causing data loss for the organizations and operational disruption by wipers. Those attackers have two goals. The first is stealing sensitive information, which then they publish on social media and Telegram channels. And the other one is to wreak havoc and cause damage. As many endpoints they can get their hands on. And for why they actually steal the data and do it is actually to sow fear and maybe cause reputational damage to the organization or the nation they did it to. So this timeline outlines an attack from the beginning of October. We found the mentioned attacks by looking at our telemetry. Our first indication that led us to investigate those attacks were attempts to terminate security solutions using vulnerable driver and looking into very suspicious web shells activity. In our presentation, we'll focus on the reconnaissance from the web server on October 5th, data exfiltration on the 7th, and data destruction on the 8th. Our focus on this presentation is to present the attack cycle, the attribution process, rather than a regular technical analysis. In those attacks, in this specific one actually, they managed to traverse from the DMZ to the internal network, gain domain admin access, and compromise the DC in under 4 days, which is exceptionally fast progression. And now let's start with the reconnaissance that happened on the 5th. The attackers gained access to the organization environment by exploiting the web servers. They deployed multiple web shells, which grant them a foothold in the network. As you can see in the web shells, they contain kinda the same code. It's actually kinda identical. And if you look at the left, that's from a Sentinel-1 report. And the right is ours, a new one. The only difference is the name of the function. The web shells they use appear to be a variation of ASPX spy. Let's review another web shell that they used. This one was named Uploader ASPX, and they actually used it to upload their tools into the network. And we found similarity in that code into a previous attack as well. As you can see, their code is almost identical as well. Now let's see some of the commands the group used. So shortly after the attackers deployed the web shells, they started to execute reconnaissance commands as well as upload their files into the server. We can see using this child process relationship that the parent of the CMD is actually W3WP, which is a process for IIS. So let's see what tools they brought and how did they run them. So they mainly brought network scanners and later wipers and tools for the destruction. So they started mapping out the network using a lot of known and publicly available scanners. They used NBT scan to scan the network for existing hosts, and they used WinEggDrop to scan a particular host. As you can see in the pictures, those scanners were also executed via the web shell. So in this point, they actually were trying to figure out where they are and where they can move inside the network. One of the scanners was actually a very interesting case. It was a scanner named NIMScan. And this particular scanner, we think, was a false flag intentionally deployed by the scanner to mislead us into believing the attack was originated from a Chinese APT. If you look up the hash they used, you will see it is mentioned inside the Bitdefender report for an APT called backdoor diplomacy. So this APT actually targets the Middle East and aligns with our target, which is also inside the Middle East. We, however, were not fooled by this mislead and continued investigating. And I will show how the attackers attempted to exfiltrate data. We found that they used a tool they wrote called SQL Extractor, which was capable of dumping SQL databases into CSV files. This tool received parameters such as the connection string, the query, the table, the number of records. It then written the data when it was executed into a hard-coded path, C Windows temp S, and they used it to dump tables from the databases of the organization they attacked. Now let's look at its execution. So if you look at the bottom picture here, you look at the tool writing a bunch of CSV files. Each CSV file was a table extracted from the SQL server. And if you look at the top picture, you can see the SQL tool execution by the web shell and the actor actually preparing the stolen data for exfiltration later by archiving the CSV files. Now we'll see how it actually sent it off. So they used WinSCP and PSP. And if you look closer look, you can see the attacker didn't care about exposing its passwords in clear text. And now we'll move into the data destruction phase. So to execute the data in the evidence destruction phase, they deployed various wipers. Out of all wipers they use, 3 novel wipers stood out. We discovered that those wipers were never been seen or published before. They weren't on VT then, and even if you search for them on VT now, you won't find them. Since those are all new, we named them based on indicators such as PDB path and the name the attacker had already given the tools. For example, partial washer was a completely custom tool while BFG Agonizer seems to have its code taken from public repositories. In this talk, we would like to focus on multilayer, a .NET wiper that we think have a lot of similarities with other tools used by the group. Those similarities that we found greatly aided in attributing this actor. We believe multilayer is a new variant of Apostle, which is a wiper previously used by the same group. So now, let's take a look at multilayer similarities to the previous tools of agonizing serpents, Apostle, IPsec helper, and Fantasy. So, looking at the left, you can see the self-delete function of multilayer. And at the right, you look at the self-delete function of IPsec helper and Apostle. If you look at the function name, the prototype, the batch file name, the command line, they are all the same. Another similarity we found was inside the recursive directory listing code. We can see multilist in the upper picture, which is one of multilayer's components. As its name suggests, it had two other components inside of it, multilist and multi-whip. And its implementation of the directory listing is very similar to the one we've seen in a previous tool, Fantasy. We can clearly see identifiable function names and variables. The last example of similarity is actually inside the reboot function of multilayer. We found a lot more examples, but we thought 3 is enough, so you will get the point. We can see multilayer implementation in the upper picture and Apostle at the bottom one. The implementation is nearly the same, but the name of the function and the usage of obfuscated strings by Apostle. So actually, all the wipers in this specific attack were blocked. And the actor tried to bypass those security solutions. We found that they used those anti-EDR techniques for the first time, but actually adding a brand new of techniques into their arsenal. They specifically targeted the installed EDRs for several days, using various different techniques, but it didn't succeed. Each attempt made more sense than the last one, and it shows that this actor had troubleshooting skills and vast resources and research time. When they failed, they tried something else, and they didn't give up. This shows a very motivated and persistent attacker. So on the first day, they attempted to manipulate the EDR service auto-start functionality to prevent it from starting. They failed. On the second day, they attempted to terminate the EDR by using a vulnerable driver, Gmer. Gmer is the anti-rootkit tool developed to remove rootkits from endpoints, but is commonly abused by attackers to terminate EDR processes. They created a tool named DRVIX that receives the target process speed for termination using command line. The tool started by loading Gmer into the kernel, then sent the PID to the driver using device IO control, which is an API used to communicate with device drivers, and then the Gmer driver terminates the target PID via ZW terminate process API, which is a kernel API. If you look at the top picture, we can see the tool communicating with the driver using device IO control. It specified the PID as the input buffer and specified the ioctl as the second argument. On the bottom picture, you can see the ioctl implementation in the driver itself of Gmer, where the Gmer driver is taking the PID out of the buffer sent by the user mode component and sending it to the termination function it has in the same driver. A day later, they made improvements to the tool because they failed again. And this time they replaced the tool, they replaced the vulnerable driver with a new one. And they obfuscated the tool itself. If we look at the top picture, we can see the tool, again, communicating with the new driver using device IO control, and the driver at the bottom picture taking the PID out of the buffer sent to him. So at the time, the POC was very new. It's been on GitHub only for 2 weeks. Now let's recap to see all the points we used to attribute this actor. So we believe with high level of confidence that the attacks mentioned are by the Iranian APT agonizing serpents. The multi-layer wiper shows multiple code similarities and similar naming convention to previously tools used by the group. And the attackers used web shell variants that had the same code, except for variable and function names that they replaced for each time they used it. And the final step of the attacks, in all those attacks, had like a scorched earth policy, where they used vipers to render all the endpoints they had unusable and just cover their tracks. And about the victims, all the victims were from Middle East organizations. And now we almost reached the end of our talk, so I would like to leave you with some key takeaways. The first takeaway is that, as we've seen, there were numerous large-scale cyber attacks that were orchestrated by nation-state actors. They used vipers to advance their agenda in geopolitical conflicts in a digital way. They didn't shoot a single bullet or a rocket, only digital. And the second takeaway is that in cases of viper or ransomware attacks, we understood that EDR logs can be very helpful in those cases. Because logs and evidence are very limited. In our investigation, we were able to reconstruct the entire timeline using EDR logs that were uploaded to the cloud. And a previous team that worked on this case that didn't use the EDR logs didn't get as far at all. The third takeaway is about having a security hygiene and best practices. And those could actually prevent some of those attacks. Organizations should always update their servers. They should implement segmentation. So it seems obvious, but organizations don't do it. They actually don't. You should deploy security solutions on all your endpoints and have backups as well as recovery plan in case everything else fails. So the last takeaway is actually about what we saw about agonizing serpents. We were able to identify 3 novel vipers and a custom SQL exfiltration tool. And we saw that the group has been stepping up their game, and we've been investing resources into bypassing security solutions throughout all their operations. So thanks everyone for attending my talk. If you'd like to read more about agonizing serpents, you can check it out on our blog on Unit 42 for Palo Alto Networks. And if anyone has questions and we have like 1 minute, you can just ask away.
Space for 1 or 2 questions.
You want to ask?
My question is, you've been showing some code snippets from the vipers, including your comments. Where do you get those?
Which code snippets you mean? The one?
The source code from the vipers.
It's actually a code. You mean the wiper techniques part?
No, I did at the end. Source novel viper.
You mean for multilayer?
Yes.
So we had a code Like we were able to get the executables by working with the organizations, and we actually got some logs, and we were able to get hashes, but the hashes themselves were uploaded to a product we have called Wildfire, which is a firewall for Palo Alto networks, and the samples were saved there. They weren't on the endpoints anymore. They were removed by the attacker, but we were able to get them because they were uploaded to the firewall. Okay, thank you everyone.